Welcome everyone, I'm GM Josh Friedel, and this lecture is on the secret life or lives of pawns. So today I'm going to go over a game from a tournament which just concluded, the Gibraltar Masters. It was won by Aronian in a playoff over a zillion players, which, you know, I like it when there's a clear winner, when it's a bunch of quick games and it feels like a lottery. But nevertheless, it's a pretty nice achievement. One of the people who tied with him for first was Le Quang Liem, who is a Vietnamese player, but who actually resides in St. Louis, who went to Webster University. Quite a strong GM, 27-37, which puts him in the world's elite, playing an extremely strong Russian Grandmaster called Daniil Dubov. Dubov is nearly 2,700, young up-and-coming player. So, and they're playing for basically all the marbles in the last round, because I doubt a draw would get either of them very much. And I found this game to be very interesting from a pawn structure perspective. Mainly because there were so many decisions to make with their pawns. But also, one of the main focuses on, and what I'd like you to keep in mind throughout the course of the lecture, is how pawns determine where your pieces should be. Because I think that's something that people forget a lot. They focus purely on the pawns, which is all well and good, but you also have to figure out, well, if my pawns are here, that usually means your pieces should be in certain positions. And that's a theme that comes up throughout this game, and probably what I want to focus on most. But of course I go off on tangents and say random things, so you never know. E4, C5. I'm not going to announce every move, but we have Rossolimo. G6. And now knight C3. To my knowledge, this is not really the most common move. Most people here either play a setup where they take and play H3, something like this, which is its own. Usually you actually go against the rules and take away from the center. B takes is a move. But the idea of this is that you open up your bishop. Very common in Lopez, very common here. And white usually even plays this to prevent this. And okay, this is a kind of a main type of system. A lot of the times they even play it before you even castle. And then it gives you the option of castling queenside sometimes. But okay, I digress. Rook E1 is a very common option here. And then, but it allows knight F6, knight D5. You don't have to play knight E5, of course, but you can play knight C3 here, knight C7. Life kind of goes on. But white opted for knight C3. So the main purpose, as far as I can tell, is that now, knight F6, you have this E5 option. And while you can still do this, you have to at least endure a slightly off knight. So for example, I can play H3 at some point, kick it back to H6. Maybe not the end of the world, but sometimes this knight can be rather annoying to have to deal with that. So I don't know. I mean, it's just another way to play, kind of. And also, it's very possible white could play rook E1 and 2, and it's pretty similar to main lines. But okay, black played E5. So already this is a notable pawn structure decision, right? So whenever you play a move like E5, what do you have to consider? Exactly. For now this is just a hole, and it's going to be a hole for a while. So when you play E5, you have to make sure that the weakness of D5 isn't too severe. For example, if there were no light squared bishops and you ended up with a knight here against a bishop here, you can almost resign. It's that bad. Obviously, I'm not advocating resignation in a position like this, but I would say that it's bad enough that it's usually just lost positionally, because this knight is just so much better. But with all the pieces on the board, that's not really the case. And you guys probably know from experience playing lots of openings, this is a weakness that's created all the time. But I would say that if you do create this weakness, you need to get something for it. You don't just create it for nothing. So what does black get for the weakened D5 square? D4. Very good control over D4. That's about as good control over D4 as a person can dream of. So if white had any hopes of playing D4, well, they're going to have to find another idea. Note how the knight's here also, so there's no C3, D4 ideas either. Sometimes that doesn't matter, but something I would note. You also prevent E5 pushes. And you create a square on E7 for your knight, which I think is rather harmonious, actually. This is a very common setup, and usually if you have pawn d6, pieces like this, you want your knight to go to e7. So it allows you that option. In any case, e5 is a very common move. So I know it's kind of early in the opening, but I like to kind of focus on, even from the very beginning of the game, where you put your pawns dictates where you put your pieces. Knight e7. So we come to this position. Now, even as early as this phase, even as early as this point, white already has a misplaced piece. I would like you guys to find it. And I'm not including like the rook on a1. Yes, the rook on a1 could be improved, but that's something we all have to live with. It's a cross we have to bear. What developed piece of white's is not placed correctly? Incidentally, I'm not totally positive you even would take with the knight. If you take with the b pawn and play d6, your structure is really nice. You control the d5 square. That's certainly not a weakness anymore. Oh, yeah. But I just like the knight here in general. I think it's out of the way. But yeah, this piece is wrong now. Because taking the knight, you're not interested in that. What's the weakness that black has? What square? d5. d5. So because of where the pawns are, because of how both sides set up, it's clear that this is now misplaced. So white fixes it. So black plays here. White plays a3. Black plays d6. So you have this position. What to do? Don't all answer at once. I'm just kidding. It's not an easy position, is it? Seems like all your pieces are decent, but what do? You can bring the bishop out to g5, but I play h6. That doesn't really help you, right? You could play bishop e3 or bishop d2, and technically you're developing a piece. You can congratulate yourself. But the problem with this is that, is the bishop really doing anything on e3 or d2?
You could play rook b1 after bishop b3, then play b4.
Very possible. But then I'm going to ask, why is your bishop on e3?
Yeah.
I'm going to play knight d4, and then your bishop doesn't really look that good to me. But Le Quang managed to find a very active move that puts black, at least forces black to make choices immediately. Let me just give you an example. If white played a move like h3. He threw this in. Sorry. I thought this was the key moments. But he threw in the move h3 to avoid bishop g4. That was my bad. But h6, we come to the same type of thing. What does black want to play, by the way? Possibly. Some positions, maybe even bishop e6. The doubled pawns look a little weird, but maybe not so easy to take advantage. But white needs a way to create activity. The general rule is, even if a game is sort of closed, if you don't have a plan to create activity or improve your pieces, your opponent probably does. So you need something to do. And I can tell you that Le Quang probably saw this position and was like, you know what? Black's idea is coming. Black's going to play king h7, f5 on me maybe. I need to do something right now. So what idea comes to mind? Knight h4? No, sorry, knight h2. Knight h2. That's possible. I wouldn't say your knight looks all that nice here. But okay, let's say I play, I don't know, king h7. Bishop e6 was also worth considering here, but f4. So you're improving your pawn. Everything makes sense. I don't know. I might be able to play f5.
Follow through with your pawn.
You might experience some problems here, right? Because your knight is just really not good, and you don't always have time to get back because this hangs. I don't know. I would be a little uncomfortable here, to be honest. He found a different idea. And I hope I'm right this time, because if I get the wrong move again, it'll be super embarrassing. G4? Uh-oh. Who wants to tell me why this move is a form of suicide?
Weakens the king.
Yes. This is not a happy king right here. Now after king h7, f5 is about 1,000,000 times stronger. Please, guys, don't play moves like g4. Save a life. So, but okay. Le Quang chooses a different path. This is a very common break in these positions. And it's hard for people to imagine because they see this weakness, right? But I can tell you that experienced players know that's not a big deal. The square can be weak till the end of time, but if you can't do anything, if you can't open up a part of the board, if you can't try to use something else, this square alone is not going to do anything for you. If black plays king h7 and lots of checkmating attack, you're not going to get a prize because you have d5. And in fact, the fact that the center is so closed actually hurts you. So you often need to create more weaknesses. You need to force black to make different decisions. So a move like b4 already poses a question to black. Are you worried about b5? Are you worried about takes? Can you take my pawn? I can tell you from experience, you'll very rarely find a GM who takes this pawn. However, that does not mean other players do not, or that people never take. Obviously, taking, if it wins a pawn, it wins a pawn. But almost always, in this kind of position, you will encounter problems if you take a pawn like this. I actually have had a student around 2300 who always wants to take this pawn. I always have to say, no, don't do it. But let's see, because taking this pawn definitely looks logical now. So what's the problem? You take back, I assume. Knight takes. How do you follow up?
Bishop a3.
Mm-hmm. And this is usually the play, that this pawn now is a huge weakness. And look at these bishops. All of a sudden, they look pretty nasty, right? So if black were to just move back, and you play here, serious problems, right? If you win the pawn back after sacrificing this, almost always you have a huge advantage. Because these pawns aren't really going anywhere. And look at these powerful pieces. So now you see the problem. The question is, can black do anything about it? There's only one real try, I think, for black to really try to hold on to this pawn. Yeah, play the other knight to c6. And here I think I found a very, very nice move for white. So I looked at rook b1, but it wasn't super convincing. Even knight a6 to c5 is possible. I looked at knight d5, but it seemed like you were letting black off too easy. But there's one piece of white's that is not quite in this queenside play. And you want to get it into play. Which piece of white's is clearly wrong? One of the pieces that's out.
Rook.
That's out. You're definitely right that if you say this rook is not well placed. The problem is it takes way too long to get in the game. Time is a factor. Queen, I don't know. Queen b1 looks a little weird. I don't trust it. Plus, remember, this is black's idea anyway. Indeed. Where would this knight like to go? Wrong side of the board. Wrong side of the board. You want to be here. Also, this hangs the knight, so be careful. So remember, the pawn structure dictates where your pieces go. What's black's weakness?
d6.
Indeed. So where should this knight be headed?
c4.
Yep. So for example, if black plays a5, you play knight b5, and c3 is going to be a world of hurt. You guys can see that, right?
Yeah.
Like seriously, seriously hurt. You're going to, no bandage is big enough after c3. So a6 is the logical course of action. And it's weird, but you can't really take advantage of this knight. And b5 is going to come in a lot of positions also. But now you play rook b1. Queen has to come out to a5. And now, believe it or not, you play very simply. You take, and then what move do you think you play as white? Better. Where does this knight want to be? So, bishop b3, I can play b5 or bishop e6. I have a move. Remember, don't give me time. I don't know about bishop e6, by the way. That's probably bad. But b5. You don't have to be that nuts. Just go here. And the queen has to go back probably, right? This is amazingly unpleasant. Remember what I told you about this bishop against the knight being almost dead? You might end up there. And although you're down a pawn, this guy is pretty bad, wouldn't you say? After a move like rook b8, you can even shove the rook in, play queen b1, queen out, rook here. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be black. What do you guys think? Okay. All right. So you see what I mean? There's almost always something, but a lot of it involves being a little subtle. If you just played rook b1, queen a5 at first, you may not have had anything. If you tried to take the knight too soon, you just fizzle out. But you play knight d2 first, wait to see what black does, and you can see how your position just builds itself. Your pieces just improve themselves. So this kind of pawn sack, when you have a structure like this kind of pawn sack happens all the time. And the reason why is because this structure is really annoying to face if you don't have a break, right? If you don't break down this structure, you're basically just getting clamped in the center. So you need a way to break it down. But black was like, well, what's the big deal? Black plays king h7. He's like, I don't care about taking on c5. It's no big deal, no skin off my back. Incidentally, another advantage of b4 is that moves like bishop e6 are really discouraged now. Because you take. These pawns with a helper on d6 don't look so bad. When they're like this, no. Never ever do this. This just looks awful. I remember even the very precise game where I learned not to do this. It was in Vermont. I think it was like early 2000s against a Ukrainian IM. And he tortured me for a long time with these pawns, and I hated the game so much I never allowed him again. So sometimes wisdom is born from pain. In any case, king h7. Dubov, I'm sure, already knows. He's almost 2,700. He's probably learned that lesson before. So white takes. So here's kind of my question for you. What did white exactly accomplish? I can't really see too well, so you can just say something. Yep. B file is definitely something you can use. Just loosen the center a little bit, right? It's a little bit looser. And that's kind of what you're playing for. You've loosened black up just that touch. But it's not going to mean anything if you don't follow it up correctly, because black still looks relatively solid. I can play b6. You've actually opened up my queen. But you'll see that a lot of the, if you're watching GMs play this kind of structure, you'll see after b4 they usually just allow you to capture. Because even though this is a slight accomplishment, it's not that big of a deal in a lot of positions. I still think it was right of white to do it, because if you don't, I think you have very little counterplay. But it's still, an upward task. But at least you have a b file. At least you have ways to put pressure. So white played rook b1, speaking of b file. Black played b6. So now what? Remember, you got to create counterplay. Though I would mention that f5 is a little bit less effective when the center is more open. Because then options like takes are a little bit less comfy, right, without a pawn here. Black either has to take with a piece and give up this square, or take with a pawn and then the king's open. See that? So that's one of the other advantages of taking, I forgot to mention. That f5 now is not unplayable, but much riskier. And again, sometimes that's all it's about. Like, you can't necessarily prevent every move, but you can at least make your opponent think twice. Make them take a risk in order to try to do something. But okay, we're just talking improving moves. How can white improve here? You take advantage of b6 a little bit with this move. a4 is coming. Does anyone know what this pawn is called, by the way? This lone guy? First of all, is this pawn a strength or a weakness? I actually think they're correct, that it's usually a strength in this structure. If this pawn weren't here, you'd be absolutely right, it's a weakness. If this pawn were here, for example, I would kind of hate white's position.
What if the pawn were on a5?
If this pawn were on a5,
Yeah.
then Yahtzee, weakness.
But the a pawn's weak though, right?
This pawn?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I mean, okay, I guess like a5, a4, then it's weak. It's isolated.
Why?
Move forward.
What's going to attack it?
I'll play bishop d7.
That's not attacking this.
I'm just saying in general, like, it could be weak.
It could be
it's
weak
stuck.
in positions with the pawn on a4 with a5. It could be weak, but this is also a weakness, right?
Agreed, yeah.
But I would say that this pawn is usually a strength more than a weakness because of the ray. It's a ray is what it's called. You just shoot the pawn up the board, it plays a5, and then black has to make structural sacrifice. They either play this, then you have the ugliest pawns ever, or you allow takes and create a weakness. So in this kind of structure, this isolated pawn, so to speak, is actually a strength. And this is what I mean by you can't go by hard and fast rules. Just because technically this is an isolated pawn does not mean it's a weakness. In this position, against this structure, this is an annoyance. This is a strength. So it's important to realize that. Because a lot of people will be like, wait, takes, I have an isolated pawn. Why am I doing this? Well, there's a very good reason. However, this pawn is not a strength at all if it can never play to a5, right? If this pawn can't head to a5, it's just, I mean, I'm not even going to say it's a weakness, but it's just sitting there, just chilling out. Which is okay. Sometimes that's all pawns can do. But you need to trade a couple pieces in order to get this guy up here, right? So how do you start? Black plays here. White trades. I thought white might try knight e3, but it's a little awkward. I don't know. I don't mind what he did exactly. So of course tactics work out. If you take this bishop, I take the knight, I have a few too many pieces. Well, one too many piece, but that's enough. If you take with the knight, of course, I make your pawns really ugly, and then I have to remember my game and cry. So of course black played queen takes e7. And how does white continue now? And once again, you're using the pawn structure to determine your course of action with your pieces. What can you do to improve a piece now? If you just take, what do you think of your position? Not horrible, right? But what are you doing? I control the center really well. You have to watch out for c4, by the way. Maybe you can maneuver this knight, but I'm still not convinced you're actually accomplishing a whole lot. So white tries to be a little sneakier. Mm-hmm. So note how with a pawn here, this kind of move tends not to be a big deal. Because, so what, you know? But now, you have a continuation which is rather annoying. C4, but guys, you're creating a weak pawn. What are you doing? So this is kind of my point. If you just take the pawn structure by itself, this pawn's horrible, right? However, why is this pawn not a weakness at all? Because this is blocked, and it's blocked forever. You're never ever moving this guy. Those are the rules. I don't care if it's attacked by a pawn. I'm just kidding. But basically, this guy is never ever moving. So if you want to take this bishop, I put a pawn there. And why is it significant that there's no pawn on d6? Apart from the fact the queen's there. I always like to avoid missteps. Why does it matter that there's no pawn here? Indeed. So now, no matter how you take this, you have to create not only give me a pawn that's taken away squares from your pieces, that's a pass pawn. So you see how, again, this structure by itself, not a good structure. Because there's a piece there, it changes the whole evaluation of the position. So I'm not saying white's killing here. Honestly, I don't even know who's better. But white's course of action, regardless of the evaluation, is a logical one, right? And the whole point is that you're not considering the pawn structure by yourself, but you're taking pieces into account, and your pawns are determining where your pieces go. And in some case, vice versa. The only reason you're playing pawn here is because there's a bishop here. If there weren't a bishop here, this move would be ridiculous, and you would get laughed at, and it would be not fun. In any case, black plays rook b8. No one likes having a pinned piece, even GMs. So here white plays this move. I thought bishop d2 was kind of more to the point, but okay, he he wants to hit the e5 pawn. Because now, by the way, I should mention, you might take this knight if it means taking this pawn for free. I should mention, it's not like you never move the bishop regardless. But okay. Black plays back. You don't want to take the bishop now, the knight now. I would say the exception, though, you might consider taking this knight if then a knight can land here. Put another piece. But okay. White plays bishop c3. Knight e7. So yeah, queen d2 I actually didn't like. I actually think the queen's kind of weird here. I don't know. I might have just played rook e1. So the idea is that now f5 is kind of discouraged. Black can play kind of like they did in the game. But the queen here I think is actually well placed for that. And I'll show you why that is. But the point is you put a rook here. You kind of improve a piece. Eventually a4, a5 is going to come. But you don't have to rush, right? That idea is not going anywhere. You just have to make sure that black's b5 move is not too annoying. But honestly, I'm not so sure that this is going to work out all that amazingly. Should probably figure out why, though. Why is this move not so great? I think the point is that now you can play queen d2 and prevent b4. And again, this pawn is actually a little loose in some of these lines. Even a move like queen b2 can be considered, not immediately, of course, but at some point because this pawn's going to be weak. I don't know. b5 is a risky move because this is kind of the side of the board that white wants to open, right? Not to mention that actually you might just take this pawn. Because even though you give up this bishop, there's now this weakness as well. So black can defend that pawn, but then you put a pawn on a4, and this pawn's against this pawn. This is a known structure that's very dangerous. So even though you have the two bishops, I don't know. I would say that this is risky for black. These pawns in the endgame are just monsters. Okay. But again, a lot of questions to consider. I'm guessing that he played queen d2, though, against that. That could be. Because I just thought it was a mysterious move. But sometimes ideas just kind of occur to me. So black played what I thought was a very nice idea. Black plays g5. Not here. So what is black's goal? And it's not a very deep one. What is black trying to do?
Knight on f4.
Knight on f4 and basically just try to checkmate. So the second the pawn lands here, the game changes entirely. How does it change? Well, let's start with what idea of black's is probably going to be less effective with a pawn on g5? Usually. Now, there's a bishop on d5, which actually works against you in the f5 positions. But in general, when you play f5, you do not want to take with a piece. So f5 ideas tend to be a little bit less good now. However, you're trying to put a knight on f4. You're trying to go after white's king, which means that white has to set up some kind of barrier. White has to make it so it's not so easy for black to just swoop in and try to give checkmate. Does king h2 help you? g3 is going to be a little tricky. Not to mention if the king here might feel a little uncomfortable lined up with this queen, all of a sudden f5 is more tempting, isn't it? Right? Because if you play here, I might have this move now. Because if you take, check, and whoopsies, right? So if my pawn lands here, by the way, you're just going to not be very happy, just so you know. Then you're playing kind of an awful King's Indian. And by the way, almost all closed pawn structures like this, when the pawn lands on f4, it's some kind of King's Indian. It can be an awful King's Indian. It can be an amazing King's Indian. From whose perspective, I don't know. But the idea is that almost always when the pawn gets here, it means that white better have really good play. I would say, though, that you have to be careful of queen b2, but as long as knight g6 is available, shouldn't be a big deal. Okay. White played rook e1. So this also discourages f5. But all right, black's idea was not f5 anyway. Knight g6. So what now? How do you try to keep black at bay? There's a common misconception, I think, about moves like g4. Whenever you play moves on your opponent's side of the board, usually you're speeding them up, not slowing them down. Now, I'm not saying g4 is completely nonsensical. If you can completely lock up the game, it's a success. But after knight f4, you better have an answer to queen g6, h5, because it's coming.
Oh yeah, I thought he might have to defend the pawn first, but I guess not.
I mean, well, queen g6 defends the pawn.
Yeah, that's a good point,
I guess queen g6, this hangs, so maybe you have to be more careful than that. But even if black plays a move like bishop f6 and h5, it just... First of all, you have to defend this pawn, and this looks really risky. Doesn't begin to cover how I feel about this move. It's... something looks off, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're just asking to get sacked on and have a brilliancy prize dropped on your face. That's all I can tell you. So g4, you have to be very careful with this kind of move. And it's one of those moves you'd rather not play unless you have everything under control. So I'm not saying forget about this move entirely, but be very cautious with moves like g4. Queen b2, but the problem is this: you're just preventing it for one move, right? I defend the pawn, and then you're not preventing it anymore.
So
Yeah.
the other idea, knight h2 to g4?
Yeah. You may not even go to g4, but the idea is that the knight here kind of keeps these pawns from rolling down your face.
So maybe you're saying like maybe you just need to leave it on
Yeah.
h2? Okay.
Now, and this is something like, it's never fun to have a knight here. But if you've played the white side of King's Indian a few times, you know that sometimes you have to. Sometimes if there are pawns just getting thrown at you, you need a piece to just stand there and go like this. Just say, look, don't hurt me too bad. I'm going to hold you off. And what you're claiming is that eventually you're going to crash through on the queen side. That if you give me enough time, I'm going to beat you on the queen side. But until then, I'm just going to hold you off. Keep you at arm's length. So sometimes moves like knight h2 are kind of necessary. So black plays knight f4. I'd be kind of scared here as white, but Le Quang is a brave fellow. He doesn't care. So he plays rook e3, trying to keep everything hung on to. Black plays h5. So queen d1. So queen d1 does two things. First of all, it kind of reminds black that this pawn could hang. Trying to tempt black into h4. Why, of course, would that be a poor move?
Then you can't break through.
Locks up the pawns. You never want to lock up the pawns where you're attacking, always. And it also keeps an eye on the other side of the board. What move might you want to play?
a4.
Indeed. So I think that queen d2 is a poor move, mostly because it just really was a waste of time in those positions. And it could be he was also worried about b5. But the more I look at b5, the more I just dislike it. Because really, that's white's side. That's not your side. So if you try to play with b5, probably something bad's going to happen. But now he's not worried about b5 at all. Because here I'm just happy. I'm like, yes, please, let's open every line possible. Because then these moves look ridiculous, right? You can't even take this bishop so easily because this pawn hangs with check, right? So I'm very happy to see b5. The second you start launching, you want to keep open board is usually not a bad thing. So black, of course, plays queen g6. And now white plays kind of a funny move. I don't know if this is a good move or not. My instincts tell me this move shouldn't be good. But that's not an argument. I'm sure if I went up to Le Quang and was like, dude, my instincts are telling you not to play this, he'd be like, all right, man. But the idea is very simple. He wants to discourage this g4 push. He wants to make it as hard for black as possible. But I think the rook could end up kind of weird here, and I'm not convinced g4 was even that playable. I can take it, play rook g3 after g4. I don't think it's such a big deal just yet. So I don't know if I would have played this, but it makes sense. He's trying to put a stop to these pawns. And he's also trying to provoke h4. And we're all happy to see h4, right? So black played f6. White played bishop d2. So again, he's just trying to put a little pressure. Once this pawn lands here, the bishop's silly here, right? So he's always looking to improve his pieces. Bishop h6. So black's building. Sometimes you get to a point where your defensive pieces are as good as they're going to be, right? Those are the moments you want to look for, you know what, now is the time to play on the other side of the board. Because let's face it, I mean, how else is white going to defend against all these guys? There's no way, right? I would say one of the things that separates like the very strongest players from players who aren't quite as good is that they know which side, when to switch gears. If you just play only defensive moves, probably you're going to lose because there's only so good your defenders can get. If you play only offensive moves, probably you're going to get checkmated. So you have to find the proper balance. Once you have the main threats taken care of and you can't really improve your defenders, that's usually the time, you know what, I'm going to play on the other side. And by the way, Playing on the queen side can help defend your king. Can you guys tell me why that might be?
Draws off the attack.
Indeed. Black then has to react. Black might have weaknesses over here, so I can't move. Sometimes if you open up this side and a rook gets in, a rook on the 7th could certainly interrupt black's attack, right? So playing on the opposite side of the board can even help you against the attack. But also it comes down to you want to have some fun too, right? So let's go. Black played queen back to e8. So black's idea here is that now if you play a5 and I play b5, you have kind of a problem. Because I've locked this down a little bit. So trying to do anything over here is going to be tricky. And now I'm threatening b4. Keep in mind with the pawn on a3, b4 was not an issue, right? So he was kind of tempting. But okay, white plays rook a1. White's not in a hurry. And black plays a5. I'm going to tell you right now, before ever in this structure you play a move like a5, take a second think. I'm not going to say it's always a bad move or that it's always a bad decision, but I'd say one of the most common pawn structure decisions I ever see made is this move a5. I will tell you, it tends to be made more often by younger players. Notice how Dubov is playing the move a5. He's a very, very young player. Obviously extremely strong. I'm not saying anything about the guy. I'm sure he knows this concept. But I can just tell you that even when it's correct, you'll see experienced GMs almost never play this move. And the reason why is they just know in the long term, this guy being weak tends not to be as important as that guy being weak. If you trade these pawns, for example, who has the weak pawn? Who has the better structure? It's white, right? This pawn is often a weakness more than a strength. And it means that white's achieved their goal. They've weakened this pawn. So almost always, it's better to allow a5 than to prevent it with a5. There are exceptions. I'm never going to say it's 100%. I would say it's maybe 70-30. But I would say that if you're going to play a5, take a second think. Never just play it. Because more often than not, that's going to be your pawn move, which was an error. And I'm telling you, this is one of the true pawn secrets I can reveal to you. Before you play a5, take a second think. I'm not saying don't play it, but I'm saying think about it. Because I think if Dubov played rook d8, for example, preparing for openings here, and b5, I think I would probably rather be black. I don't like having my pieces like this. Maybe you're arguing I'm elitist or something, but somehow this doesn't make me happy. So honestly, after b5, I don't know. I might rather be black. Still complicated. I'm not saying the game is simple. But the second I see this move, I know that in the long term, you have to be very careful. And you're going to see what I mean, because a few things happened in the game that didn't go in black's favor. You're going to see how awful this move can be.
So that's what was played in the actual game.
Was a5, indeed. Okay. And I'm telling you, most older, experienced GMs, you will very rarely see this move. This is just something I've noticed. I even had a game, I remember, it was the US Championship. I was watching with Alex Golden, who is, I worked with as a trainer, who's a very experienced GM. I think he's almost 50 now. And we were watching a game of Ray Robson's. Obviously, Ray is extremely strong, stronger than me, right? It was an endgame where he was defending against Yasser Seirawan. And he was thinking about the move a5. And I was looking at it, but I was kind of leaning against it. Ray, by the way, played it very fast. This exact move in a similar structure. I was thinking about it, and I was like, it's interesting, maybe, but it may not be necessary. I'd rather not play it. And Golden was like, a5, fish move. And I think that really highlights the difference in experience. It doesn't mean he's always going to be right, but it means that experienced GMs are far less likely to play this move. So be very careful. In any case, knight f1.
Quick question.
Yep.
So I was going to ask this earlier, like I feel like, from what I've seen, like GMs will play, like after a5, like, would you play ba5 there? Is that almost automatic rather than have the weakness on d6? I know this position, like the
I would say, no, I'd say almost never do you take.
Never take?
Because if you take, then you have two weaknesses.
Right.
I'd rather have one than two.
Okay.
But the point is, this, you give the weakness anyway.
Right.
and it doesn't take as an extra move. The thing with a5 though is it opens up the a file, so it's an extra thing. Although in this particular case, there's b5 as a move.
Okay.
So they're all
Yeah.
different. Again, like you can't do 100%, but I'm just saying like if you take that extra think, if you're a little bit more reluctant, I think it helps you.
Okay.
And I can tell you that these young players like Dubov and like Robson, the more they look at them, the more reluctant they become as they get more experienced. So it doesn't mean you never play it. I think that's also a mistake. But you want to be reluctant. You want it to be difficult. So black played rook d8. So here I actually thought that white could sack a pawn with knight e3. Takes knight f5. And I thought that if you ever give this bishop for this knight, you're just going to be very unhappy with your life. But okay, he didn't want to sack anything. He played rook a3. Again, probably wouldn't be, I don't know. I wanted to just play knight e3, but whatever. Bishop c8, knight e3, rook d6, rook f3. So here, I'm trying to remember here. So rook f3, he wants to play knight f5, but he's worried about some kind of takes here and takes here. So he's trying to, yeah, this is actually a very tricky move. Because if you play knight f5 immediately, your rook's hanging. But when you move it, you're now threatening knight f5 because after takes, your rook is no longer hanging. These guys are clever, aren't they? But yeah, it's kind of a very common sort of GM trick. But okay, bishop d7, g4, your move. What is the difference between g4 now and g4 previously? And I should mention that this was another point of rook f3. Because now I think this is actually an excellent move. It doesn't look that different, but the key difference is that now white has an improved piece, right? This knight is here, ready to hop into f5, ready to control this pawn. So basically what white's saying is that now when I play g4, you're going to be completely controlled. And you're not going to be able to sack here. This rook may look strange, but it's actually okay placed because it's defending this pawn. So yeah, so incidentally, just so you know, I did lie to you before. Knight f5 here. I thought that this was all clever, but the problem is that now this rook is just trapped. Just thought I'd let you know, so don't listen to me too closely. Yeah, so g4 was his main idea. Black plays rook h8. Rook g3. Again, I think knight f5 immediately was playable, but he played rook g3 first, bishop back, knight f5. So there's no choice but to take, right? This is why I hate this move. All of a sudden, black would way rather have the pawn here. So at least you have the hope of not just giving up all the light squares in the universe. And this is kind of the problem. When you have a pawn here, if you get a position like this, you're basically signing up to sit for the rest of the game. You will not get to play a single active move. Because with this pawn here, white can take all the time in the world. Now, you might argue that, well, I don't want to open up the board anyway. But when you play this move, you have a weakness here, and you have no counterplay forever. And it's one of those reasons why, again, the more experienced players are, the more reluctant they are to play a move like this. Because it defines the pawn structure completely and makes it so that you just don't have any form of counterplay. And believe me, in this position, you want some counterplay. So black played here. Now there's no point because you're not really going to do anything on the king side anyway. Rook e3, queen h5. I'm not objecting to an endgame. Rook b3. Are you guys starting to see what I mean about black's position? This guy is just a weakness, right? Is this a weakness? Now you could argue that black made some mistakes to get here, and I'd say you'd be right. But when you have to be this cautious, it often means that you maybe made a weakness you shouldn't have made. But okay, bishop e7. So black's claim is just that you're not going to be able to break through. I'm going to put a bishop here, and how are you going to get in? So Le Quang was like, let me show you. Rook e1, king g2. So what's he trying with king g2? Where's he headed?
G4.
Note how he's not really in a rush. And guess what? He doesn't have to be. There's no counterplay, right? So in this position, I think black blundered. Black should probably play knight f4, takes, takes, but white has a very strong idea here. You could have taken with the g pawn, but then h4 is just a free pawn, basically. And you can play rook g1 to g5, g6. But what does white do here? Keep in mind that even as pretty as your position may look, if you can't break through, being pretty doesn't count for anything. Well, it counts for a little. Depends on the type of tournament you're playing. But for the most part, you need something concrete. You need a way to break through. So how do you break through here? How many breaks do you have?
With e-pawn?
2.
Okay, so how do you play for e5?
Play it.
You can. And then what?
Pawn takes and rook e1 or something, but thought bishop f6. I didn't really.
Yeah, but why do you feel like you have to be fancy about it? Just be a plebeian, it's fine. Rook e1.
Oh.
You just can't stop it. Exactly. And once you get an e5, you bring your rook in. Should be nice and toasty. All right. But black played here instead. He's still saying, look, I got you covered. You don't have a breakthrough. Perhaps. Yeah. You don't have to quite sack a piece to get what you want, though. Get rid of your weak pawn. I'm calling it weak because we know it's not with the bishop here, right? But d4. And you see how black's whole opera kind of falls apart here? So if takes, c5, takes, takes, this is just pretty brutal. Because now if you play here, probably I have lots of ways to do this, actually. The simplest is probably just taking and creating a passer, no? I mean, the two bishops are going to kind of wreck you here. But okay. Yeah, maybe there was even something better. I'm not sure. But this looks pretty good. In any case, note how you have more options when you're not down a piece. Always a plus. So black took here, and now what?
I'm the worst at this.
Keep your bishops. So now taking here is pretty much illegal because I take the knight for free, right?
Oh, yeah.
Takes here. I thought maybe sacking the exchange was an okay try, but even here, this is pretty much over. Because rook c6 is a problematic move next. And you have to move the knight because this is still a threat. So you have to go here, then here. And you don't get to keep your connected passers is more the point. Unless you want to trade rooks, which will have problems. But okay, I thought maybe it was a better practical try. Black just played back, which is actually interesting. So now what? Yeah, this is the kind of thing which you want to consider always, like right away. Because it's like, think about it. With your rooks just sitting here, if these rooks can't get in, they're just sitting there. They're waiting at the drawbridge forever, right? You got to crash through eventually. So yeah. Now you're threatening bishop g5. You're threatening pawn takes f6. I don't know about you, but looks kind of overwhelming. Not to mention being down in exchange when you have these two monster bishops is not such a bad thing. But notice what he chose in the game did not give up any of his monstrous pieces, right? He kept them all. So black played knight f4. Check. Take, take, take. So here he could have been, he got a little lazy. I think that like this would have just ended the game. I mean, okay, you can take this bishop, but I don't think that's going to help your cause too much. These pawns are a little strong. But okay, he did it kind of the simpler way. He just took, which is fine, of course. d3, king back. And soon enough, it was just over. He resigned here because he's going to have to, these pawns roll. You win the rook, and you have a zillion pawns. So anyway, it was kind of an interesting battle. Notice that really you defied a lot of pawn structure norms. You created weaknesses to kind of assist your pieces. Your pieces went where the pawn said they should go. notice how when these pawns are ripping down the board, you have to put a piece on an ugly square, but that's where the pawn said the piece had to go. Otherwise, you would have just run into a nasty attack. And then notice how this a5 move, it looked kind of harmless at first, right? How bad was this move at the end? Just awful, right? It allowed white to just crash through completely. So be very, very careful about any move, I would say, that completely locks the pawn structure is a move you got to be careful of, because usually you can't take that back. Once you've played a5, you can't be like adjust later in the game, unless you're really sneaky. So just the kind of thing you have to be careful with. But again, kind of not a perfect game by any means, but I thought it was really nice the way he, not only the way he took advantage of this, but the way he kind of regrouped from, in my opinion, in a tough position, brought his pieces back, and then eventually crashed through with some nice pawn breaks. Like the d4 pawn break is kind of a classic, and just very nice.